When I got the call that my uncle had been arrested again, I wasn't surprised. He was charming, reckless, and unpredictable, the kind of guy who knew his way around trouble and didn't seem to mind it. But this time felt different. It wasn't just a few months. He was facing 10 years, a decade behind bars, for possession of over a pound of cocaine. They said it was hidden in the trunk of his car, packed away as casually as groceries. It stung. He'd promised us he was clean, that his wild years were behind him. Even at Thanksgiving, he'd go out of his way to remind us all that he was on the straight and narrow. We'd had our doubts. Old habits don't vanish overnight, after all. But a pound? None of us had seen that coming. My uncle swore up and down the drugs weren't his, said he was framed, that someone wanted to see him gone for good. But when we pressed him on it, he'd just clam up, muttering that spending a decade locked away was better than what they would do to him. After he was sentenced, my mom called, her voice tight, asking if I could go to his place and sort through his things. It was typical family duty, the kind of thing I couldn't turn down. I wasn't close with him, but family ties run deep enough to leave you feeling responsible, even when you know you shouldn't. So, with him locked away for the next 10 years, I volunteered to clear out his apartment, move his things to storage. I didn't know why I was so eager, but maybe I felt like it was the least I could do. The place was a disaster, exactly as I expected. His kitchen cupboards were filled with thrift store pots and pans, each one more scratched and mismatched than the last. I could see him at the stove, cigarette dangling from his lips, stirring whatever random meal he'd thrown together in those beat-up pans. The living room was its own kind of graveyard. Ashtrays covered nearly every surface, filled with weeks' worth of cigarette butts, and the walls were a deep, sickly yellow from years of constant smoke. Even the light switches had turned the same shade, crusted over from the nasty habit that had stained every inch of the place. It was clear he hadn't cracked a window in years. I found myself running my fingers along the walls, almost wondering if the yellow residue would come off. It didn't. In one corner of the room was his pride and joy, a collection of Star Trek figurines and posters, lined up on a crooked shelf he'd likely hammered up himself. He'd been a fan for as long as I could remember, always rambling about episodes I'd never seen and characters I couldn't name. Dozens of plastic figures with blank, determined stares watched me pack up their home, my uncle's treasures boxed up and ready to be hidden away for who knew how long. It took a few days, but I finally got the majority of the place packed. 3 trips in my truck, hauling boxes and crates to the storage facility across town until the apartment was stripped bare. The only things left were the stained carpet, the nicotine-coated walls, and the broken blinds barely hanging in the windows. There was no way he was getting his security deposit back. The damage was practically baked into the place. But it didn't matter anymore. As I sorted through the last of the kitchen, my hand brushed against something tucked away in the shadows of the cabinet. I pulled it out and found myself holding a small, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and worn, the leather soft from age, with a faint smell of cigarette smoke clinging to it. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle, and marked with years of kitchen chaos, stains, smudges, and scribbled notes everywhere. The entries were scattered, written down in no particular order, almost as if whoever kept this book had jotted recipes down the moment they'd been created, without thought of organization. As I skimmed the pages, a feeling crept over me that this book might have belonged to my grandfather. He was the one who'd brought the family together, year after year, with his homemade dishes. Every holiday felt anchored by the meals he'd cooked, recipes no one had ever been able to quite replicate. This book could very well hold the secrets to those meals, a piece of him that had somehow made its way into my uncle's hands after my grandfather passed. And yet, I couldn't shake a strange sense of dread as I held it. The leather was cold against my hands, almost damp, and a chill worked its way through me as I turned the pages. It felt wrong somehow, as if there was more in this book than family recipes. Curious about the book's origins, I brought it to my mom. She took one look at the looping handwriting on the yellowed pages and nodded, her face softening with recognition. "This was your grandfather's," she said, almost reverently, tracing her fingers along the ink. She hadn't seen it in years, and when I told her where I'd found it, a look of surprise flickered across her face. She had been searching for the book for ages, and had never realized her brother had kept it all this time. As she flipped through the pages, nostalgia mingled with something else. maybe a touch of sadness or reverence. I could tell this book meant a lot to her, which only strengthened my resolve to preserve it. Could I hang on to it a little longer? I asked. I want to scan it, make a digital copy for myself so we don't lose any of his recipes. My mom agreed without hesitation, grateful that I was taking the time to safeguard something she hadn't known was still around. So I got to work. Over the next few weeks, in the gaps of my day-to-day life, I carefully scanned each page. I wasn't too focused on the content itself, more concerned with making sure each recipe was clear and legible, and didn't pay close attention to the strange ingredients and odd notes scattered throughout. My only goal was to make the text accessible, giving life to a digital copy that would be preserved indefinitely. Once I finished, I spent a few hours merging the scanned images, piecing them together to create a seamless digital version. When it was finally done, I returned the original to my mom, feeling a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. The family recipes were now safe, and I thought that was the end of it. But that sense of unease I'd felt in the kitchen, holding that worn leather cover, lingered longer than I expected. In the months that followed, I didn't think much about the recipe book. Scanning it had been a small side project, the kind I'd meant to follow up on by actually cooking a few of my grandfather's old dishes. But like so many side projects, I got wrapped up in other things, and the book's contents drifted to the back of my mind, filed away and forgotten. Then Thanksgiving rolled around. I made my way to my parents' place, expecting the usual turkey, stuffing, and the familiar spread that had become tradition. When I got there, though, I noticed something different right away. A large bird sat in the middle of the table, roasted to perfection, but something about it didn't look right. It was too small for a turkey, and its skin looked darker, almost rougher than the golden brown I was used to. "Nice chicken," I said, figuring they'd switch things up for a change. My mom just shook her head. "It's not a chicken," she said quietly. "It's a hen." I gave her a confused look. "What's the difference?" I asked, half laughing, expecting her to shrug it off with a quick explanation. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes unfocused, as if she were lost in thought. For a moment, her face seemed distant, almost blank, as though I'd asked a question she couldn't quite place. Then suddenly, she blinked, her gaze snapping back to me. "It's just what the recipe called for," she said, a strange edge to her voice. Something about it made the hair on my arms prickle, but I pushed the feeling aside, figuring she'd just been caught up in the cooking chaos. Yet, as I looked at the bird again, a small flicker of unease crept in, settling in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. After dinner, I pulled my dad aside in the kitchen, while my mom finished clearing the table. "What's the deal with Mom tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He just shrugged, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "You know how your mother is," he said with a small smile, as though her strange excitement was just one of those quirks. He didn't give it a second thought, already moving on. But I couldn't shake the weirdness. The whole meal had been off. The hen, unlike anything we'd had before, was coated in a sweet-smelling sauce that seemed to have a faint hint of walnut to it, almost masking its pale, ashen hue. The bird lay on a bed of unfamiliar greens, probably some sort of garnish, alongside perfectly sliced parsnips and radishes that seemed too neatly arranged, like it was all meant to look a certain way. The whole thing was far too elaborate for my mom's usual Thanksgiving style. When she finally sat, she let us in saying grace, her voice soft and reverent. As she began cutting into the hen, a strange glint of excitement lit up her face, one I wasn't used to seeing. She served it up, watching each of us intently as we took our first bites. I wasn't sure what I expected, but as I brought a piece to my mouth, I could tell right away this wasn't the usual Thanksgiving fare. The meat was tough, almost stringy, and didn't pull apart easily, a far cry from the tender turkey or even chicken I was used to. Mom kept glancing between my dad and me with a kind of eager glee, as though she were waiting for us to say something. It was unsettling, her eyes wide, as if she were waiting for us to uncover some hidden secret. When I finally asked, "What's got you so excited, Mom?" she just smiled, her expression softening. "Oh, it's just this cookbook you found from Grandpa's things. It's like having a part of him here with every meal I make." She spoke with a reverence I hadn't heard in her voice for a long time, as though she were talking about more than just food. I gave her a nod, trying to humor her. "Tastes good," I said, hoping she'd ease up. I enjoyed it. But in truth, I wished we'd had a more familiar Thanksgiving dinner. The meal wasn't exactly bad, but something tasted a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it, and maybe I didn't want to. After we finished, I said my goodbyes and headed home, trying to shake the lingering sense of unease. My mom's face, her excitement, kept replaying in my mind. And then there was the hen itself. Why a hen? Why the pale, ashen sauce? There was something almost ritualistic in the way she'd prepared it, a strange precision I'd never seen from her before. The night stretched on, the questions gnawing at me, taking root in a way that wouldn't let me rest. When I got home, I couldn't shake the weird feeling from dinner. I sat down at my desk, opening the scanned file I'd saved to my desktop months ago. The folder had been sitting there, untouched, and now that I finally had it open, I could see why I'd put it off. The handwriting was dense and intricate, almost a kind of calligraphy, each letter curling into the next. The words seemed to dance across the pages in a strange, whimsical flow. I had to squint, leaning closer to make sense of each line. As I scrolled through the recipes, a chill ran down my spine. They had unsettling names, the kind that felt more like old spells than recipes. Mother's Last Supper, porridge, binding broth of bone and leaf, elder's ember bread, hollow heart soup with morning onion. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I could almost feel a heaviness creeping into the room, the words themselves holding an eerie energy. Then I found it, the recipe for the dish my mother had made tonight, Ancestors' Offering. The recipe was titled in that same swirling calligraphy, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I read the description. It was for a maple braised hen with black walnut and root puree, though it didn't sound like any recipe I'd ever seen. The instructions were worded strangely, written in a style that made it feel centuries old. Each ingredient was listed with specific purpose and detail, as though it held some secret power. My eyes skimmed down to the meat. It specified a hen, not just any chicken. The body must be that of a mother, it read. I felt a shiver go through me, remembering the strange way my mom had insisted on using a hen, correcting me when I'd casually referred to it as chicken. The instructions continued, noting that the hen had to be served on a bed of lamb's lettuce, a type of honeysuckle, according to a quick Google search. And then, as I read further, a chill seeped into my bones. The recipe stated it must be served just before the end of twilight, as dusk yields to night. I thought back to dinner, and the way we'd all sat down, just as the last of the sun's light faded beyond the horizon. But the final instruction was the worst part, and as I read it, my stomach twisted in revulsion. The recipe called for something it referred to as Ancestors' Salt. The note at the bottom explained that this salt was a sprinkle of the ashes of those who have returned to the earth, with a warning to use it sparingly, as each grain remembers the one who offered it. I sat back, cold sweat breaking out across my skin as I recalled the pale, ashen sauce coating the hen, the faint, sweet scent it gave off. My mind raced, piecing together what it implied. Had my mom actually used ashes in the meal? Had she used my grandfather's ashes? I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just some old folklore nonsense. But the image of her smiling face as she served us that meal, the gleam in her eyes, crept back into my mind. I felt my stomach churn, bile rising in my throat as the horrifying thought sank deeper. A few days later, the gnawing unease had become impossible to ignore. I told myself I was probably just overreacting, that the weird details in the recipe were nothing more than some strange family tradition I didn't understand. Still, I couldn't shake the dread that crept up every time I remembered that meal. So, I decided to call my mom. I planned it out, careful to come off as casual. The last thing I wanted was for her to think I was accusing her of something as insane as putting ashes in our food. I asked about my dad, about her gardening, anything to warm her up a bit. Then I thanked her for the Thanksgiving dinner, even going so far as to say it was the best we'd had in years. When I finally brought up the recipe book, her voice brightened instantly. "Oh, thank you again for finding it," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I had no idea he'd cataloged so many wonderful recipes. I knew your grandfather's cooking was special, but to have all these dishes recorded, like his own little legacy, it's been such a joy." I chuckled, trying to keep my tone light. "I actually looked up that dish you made us, Ancestors' Offering. Thought maybe I'd give it a try myself sometime." "Oh, really?" she replied, sounding intrigued. "Yeah, though I thought it was a little strange the recipe specifically calls for a hen, and not just a regular chicken, since they're so much tougher, and the part that says it should be the body of a mother." I let the words hang, hoping she'd jump in with some explanation that would make it all seem less sinister. For a moment, there was just silence on her end. Then quietly she said, "Well, that's just how your grandfather wrote it, I suppose." Her voice was different now, lower, as if she were carefully choosing her words. My heart thumped in my chest, and I decided to press a little further. "I also noticed it calls for something called Ancestors' Salt," I said, feigning confusion, pretending I hadn't read the footnote that explicitly described it. "What's that supposed to be?" The silence was even longer this time, stretching out until it became a ringing hum in my ears. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I have to go," she murmured, sounding almost dazed. Before I could respond, the line clicked, leaving me in the heavy, stunned quiet. I tried calling her back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Her phone was off. My stomach twisted as I stared at the blank screen. I couldn't tell if I was more scared of what I might find out, or of what I might already know. I hesitated, but eventually called my dad's phone, feeling a need to at least check in. When he picked up, I told him about my call with Mom, and how strange she'd been acting. "She went into her garden right after you two spoke," he said, sounding unconcerned. "Started tending to her plants, hasn't said a word since." I tried nudging him a bit, asking if he could maybe get her to talk to me, but he just brushed it off. "You're overreacting. You know how your mother is. Gets all sentimental over family things. It'll just upset her if you keep nagging her about it. Give her some space." I nodded, trying to take his advice to heart. "Yeah, all right. You're probably right." After we hung up, I resolved to let it go and went about my day, chalking it up to my mom's usual habit of getting overly attached to anything with sentimental value. She'd always treated family heirlooms like they carried something sacred, almost magical. But this time, I couldn't fully shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something that made it impossible to forget about that recipe book. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Sitting back down at my computer, I opened the digital copy and scrolled aimlessly through the pages. Part of me knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't resist. I let the file skip down to a random section, thinking I'd try making something small, something harmless. As I scrolled, I found myself staring at the very last page, which held a recipe titled Elder's Ember Bread. The instructions were minimal, yet each word seemed heavy, steeped in purpose. Beneath the title, a note read, "Best served in small portions on cold, dark nights. The taste is best enjoyed alone, lest the voices of the past linger too long." I shook my head, half amused, half unnerved. It was all nonsense, I told myself. Probably just some old superstitions my grandfather had picked up along the way. But something about it had my heart pounding, just a bit harder. Ignoring the rising chill, I printed the recipe and took it to the kitchen. I'd play along, I figured. It was just bread, after all. I scanned the list of ingredients for Elder's Ember Bread, feeling time slip away as though I'd been pulled into some strange trance. My mind blurred over, details of the process fading into a fog, yet I couldn't stop moving. I gathered everything without really thinking about it, each step drawing me deeper, as though I were following some ancient, well-worn path. I remembered flashes, the sweet scent of elderberry and honey, the earthy weight of raw rye, the dry, pungent aroma of wood burnt to charcoal. At some point, I murmured something under my breath, words of thanks to my ancestors that I hadn't consciously decided to speak. The smell of warmed goat's milk lingered in the air, blending with a creamy, thick butter that had blackened over low heat. A faint scent of yew ash drifted up as I worked, curling into my nose like smoke from an unseen fire. By the time I came to my senses, night had fallen, the kitchen shadowed and still. And there, sitting on the counter, was the bread. A dark, dense loaf, blackened at the crust, but glistening with an almost unnatural sheen. It looked rich and moist, and as I stared at it, a strange sense of pride swelled up within me, unnatural and unsettling. Like a voice in the back of my mind was urging me to feel pleased, insisting that I'd done well. Without really thinking, I cut myself a slice and carried it to the living room, feeling compelled to enjoy my creation. I took a bite, and the bread filled my mouth with an earthy, bittersweet taste, smoky, yet tinged with a subtle berry sweetness. It was unusual, nothing like I'd ever tasted before, but it was oddly satisfying. As I chewed, a warmth bloomed deep in my chest, spreading through me like the steady heat of a wood stove. It was comforting, almost intimate, as if the bread itself were warming me from the inside out. Before I knew it, I'd finished the entire slice, not because I'd particularly enjoyed it, but because some strange sense of obligation had pushed me to finish every bite. When I set the plate down, the warmth remained, a heavy presence settled deep inside me, and in the silence that followed, I could have sworn I felt a faint, rhythmic beat, a heartbeat, steady and ancient, pulsing faintly beneath my skin. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn back to the elder's ember bread more often than I intended. I'd notice myself in the kitchen, knife in hand, halfway through slicing a thick piece from the loaf before even realizing I'd gotten up to do it. It was instinctive, almost as if some quiet impulse guided me back to it on those quiet, late nights. Each time I took a bite, that same deep warmth would swell inside me, radiating outward like embers glowing from a steady fire. But unlike the hen my mother had made, a meal that left me with a lingering sense of discomfort, the ember bread felt different. It was as though each bite carried something I couldn't quite place, something familiar and almost affectionate, like a labor of love embedded into every grain. The days blended together, but the questions didn't go away. I tried to reach out to my mother several times, hoping she might open up about the recipe book, maybe explain why we both seemed so drawn to these strange meals. But each time I brought it up, she'd evade the question, either changing the subject or claiming she was too busy to talk. She hadn't invited me over for dinner since Thanksgiving, and the distance between us felt like a slow, widening gulf. Even my dad, when I'd asked about her, shrugged it off, saying she was just going through a phase. But the coldness in her responses, her repeated avoidance of the book, only made me more certain that there was something she wasn't telling me. Still, I kept returning to the ember bread, feeling its subtle pull each time the sun set, as though I were being guided by something unseen. And each time I took a bite, it felt less like a meal and more like communion, a quiet bond that was growing stronger with every piece I consumed. After weeks of unanswered questions, I decided to reach out to my uncle at the prison. I was allowed to leave a message, so I kept it short. Told him it was his nephew, wished him well, and let him know I'd left him $100 in commissary. The next day, he called me back, his voice scratchy over the line but appreciative. "Hey, thanks for the cash," he said with a short chuckle. "You know how it is in here. Money makes things easier." We chatted for a bit, catching up. He'd been in and out of prison so often that I'd come to see it as his way of life. In his 60s now, he talked about his time behind bars, with a kind of acceptance, almost relief. "By the time I'm out again, I'll be an old man," he said, almost amused. "It's not the worst place to grow old." Then I took a breath and brought up the reason I'd called. "I don't know if you remember, but when I was packing up your place, I found this old recipe book." I hesitated, then quickly added, I gave it to Mom. Thought she'd get a kick out of it." His response was immediate. The warm, casual tone in his voice shifted, growing cold and sharp. "Listen to me," he said, each word weighted and deliberate. "If you have that book, you need to throw it into a fire." "What?" I stammered, caught off guard. "It's just a cookbook." "It's not just a cookbook," he replied, his voice low, almost trembling. "That book, it brings out terrible things in people." He paused, as though considering how much to say. "My father, your grandfather, he was into some dark stuff, Stuff you don't just find in the back of an old family recipe. And that book? He took a breath. That book wasn't his. It belonged to his mother, your great-grandmother, passed down to him before he even knew what it was. My mother used to say those recipes were meant for desperate times. The gravity of his words settled into me, and I felt the weight of it all suddenly make sense. They were used to survive hard times, he continued, voice quiet. You've heard about what people did during the Great Depression, how desperate families were. But this, he exhaled sharply. Those recipes are ancient, passed down through whispers and word of mouth, long before they were ever written down. But they're not for everyday meals. They're for invoking things, bringing things out, the kind of things that can take hold of you if you're not careful. My hand tightened around the phone as a cold shiver traced down my spine, my mind flashing back to the ember bread, the warmth it had left in my chest, the strange satisfaction that hadn't felt entirely my own. Promise me, he continued, his voice almost pleading. Don't let Mom or anyone else use that book for anything casual. Those recipes can keep a person alive in hard times, sure, but they weren't meant to be used. Not unless you're ready to live with the consequences. A chill settled over me as I realized just how deep this all went. I hesitated, then told my uncle the truth. I'd already made one of the recipes. I described Elder's ember bread to him, the earthy sweetness, the warmth it filled me with, leaving out the part about how I'd almost felt compelled to eat it. He let out a harsh sigh and scolded me, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard. You shouldn't have touched that bread, none of it. Do you understand me? I felt a pang of guilt. I know. I'm sorry. I promise. I won't make anything else from the book. Good, he said, his voice calming a little. But that's not enough. You have to get that book away from my sister, your mother, before she does something she can't take back. I tried to assure him I'd do what I could, but he cut me off, his tone deadly serious. You need to do this. Something bad will happen if you don't. Over the next few weeks, as Christmas approached, I stayed in touch with him, paying the collect call fees to keep our conversations going. Every time we talked, the discussion would circle back to the book. I'd tell him about my progress, or lack of it, how I'd tried visiting my mom, only for her to brush me off with excuses, saying she was too busy or that it wasn't a good time. And each time I talked to her, she seemed to grow colder, more distant, as if that recipe book were slowly casting a shadow over her. One day, I decided to drop by without any notice at all. When I showed up on her doorstep, she didn't seem pleased to see me. You should have called first, she said with a forced smile. It's rude, you know, just showing up like this. Her tone was tight, her words clipped. I tried to play it off, shrugging and saying I'd just missed her and wanted to check in. But as I scanned the house, I felt a creeping sense of unease. I looked for any sign of the book, hoping I could find it and take it with me, but it was nowhere to be seen. Each time, I'd leave empty-handed, feeling like I was being watched from the shadows as I walked out the door. Every call with my uncle became more urgent, his insistence that I retrieve the book growing into a kind of desperation. You have to try harder, he'd say, his voice strained. If you don't get that book away from her, something's going to happen. You have to believe me. And deep down, I did believe him. The memory of the ember bread, the strange warmth, and the subtle pull of that old recipe gnawed at me, as though warning me of something far worse waiting in that book. But it was more than that. Something in my mom's voice, her distant gaze, even her scolding felt off. And every time I left her house, I felt a chill settle over me, like I was getting closer to something I wasn't prepared to see. Christmas Day finally arrived, and despite my mother's recent evasions, there was no avoiding me this time. I gathered up the presents I'd bought for them, packed them into my car, and drove to their house, hoping the tension that had grown between us would somehow ease in the warmth of the holiday. When I knocked, she opened the door and offered a quick, half-hearted hug. The scent of baked ham and sweet glaze wafted out, thick and rich, and for a second, I thought maybe she'd set aside that strange recipe book and return to her usual cooking. I relaxed a little, hoping the day would be less tense than I'd feared. "Where's Dad?" I asked, glancing around for any sign of him. "Oh, he's in the garage," she said, waving it off. "Got a new gadget he's fussing over, you know him." She gestured toward the dining room, where plates and holiday decorations were already set up. "Why don't you sit down? Lunch is almost ready." I took off my coat, glancing back at her. She was already turned away, busying herself with the last touches on the table, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and I could sense the familiar warmth in her was missing. It was like she was there, but somehow absent. Not wanting to disobey my mother on Christmas, I placed my gifts with the others under the tree and took my seat at the dining table. The plate in front of me was polished and waiting, a silver fork and knife perfectly aligned on either side, but the emptiness of it left an unsettling pit in my stomach. "Should I go get Dad?" I called out, glancing back toward the hallway that led to the garage. He'd usually be the first to greet me, especially on a holiday. The silence from him was off-putting. "He'll come when he's ready," my mother replied, her voice carrying from the kitchen. "He had a big breakfast, so he can join us later. Let's go ahead and start." Something about her response didn't sit right. It wasn't like my dad to skip a Christmas meal, not for any reason. A small, insistent thought tugged at me. Maybe it was the book again, casting shadows over everything in my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I'll just go say hello to him," I said, rising from the table. Before I'd even taken a step, she entered the dining room, carrying a large ham on an ornate silver platter. The meat was dark and glossy, almost blackened, the glaze thick and rich, coating every crisscrossed cut she'd made in the skin. The bone jutted out starkly from the center, pale against the charred flesh. "Sit down," she said, her voice oddly stern, a hint of irritation slipping through her usual holiday warmth. "This is a special meal. We should enjoy it together." I stopped, glancing from her to the closed door of the garage, the words "special meal" repeating in my head, setting off warning bells. Still, I stood my ground, my stomach churning. "I just want to see Dad, that's all. I haven't even said hello." Her face tensed, her grip tightening around the platter as her voice rose. "Sit down and enjoy lunch with me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, like a command I was supposed to follow without question. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lying just beneath the surface of her insistence. "No!" I snapped, my voice echoing through the dining room. "I've had enough of this, Mom. You've been obsessed with that damn recipe book, and I'm done with it." My heart pounded as I looked at her, my words hanging thick in the silence, but I didn't back down. "I'm going to the garage to get Dad. We're putting an end to this right now." Her face contorted, desperation spilling from her eyes. "Please, just sit down," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she looked at the untouched plate in front of me. "Let's have this meal together. It's important." I took a step toward the garage, determined to get my dad out here, to make him see how far she'd gone. That book had wormed its way too deep into her mind. She shrieked and threw herself in front of the door, arms outstretched as if to block my path. Her face was flushed, her voice frantic. "Don't go in there. Please just sit down. Enjoy the meal. Savor it," she begged, her hands trembling as she reached out, practically pleading. There was a desperation in her voice that sounded like fear, not just of me, but of what lay beyond that door. "Mom, you're acting crazy. We need to talk, and I need to see Dad." I tried to push past her, but she held her ground, her body a thin, shaky barrier. "Please," she whispered, voice thin and desperate. "You don't understand. Don't disturb him." "Dad," I called out, raising my voice over her pleas. Silence answered at first, followed by a muffled sound, a low, guttural moan, thick and unnatural, rising from the other side of the door. I froze, my blood turning cold as the sound slipped into a horrible, wet gurgle. My mother's face went white, her eyes wide with terror as she realized I'd heard him. I felt a surge of adrenaline take over, and before she could react, I shoved her aside and yanked open the door. The sight that met me would be seared into my memory forever. I stepped into the garage and froze, my stomach lurching at the scene before me. My dad lay sprawled across his workbench, his face pale and slick with sweat. His right leg was tied tightly with a belt just above the thigh, a makeshift tourniquet, attempting to staunch the flow of blood. A pillowcase was wrapped around the raw, exposed flesh, where his leg had been crudely severed, and blood pooled on the concrete floor beneath him, glistening in the cold fluorescent light. He lifted his head weakly, his eyes glassy and unfocused. His mouth moved, trying to form words, a barely audible rasp escaping as he struggled to speak. Help. Me. I didn't waste a second. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly it was hard to hit the right buttons. My mother's shrill screams erupted from behind me as she lunged into the garage, her hands clawing at the air, pleading, "Stop! Please! Just sit down, just have lunch with me!" She wailed, her voice high-pitched and frantic. Her face was twisted in desperation, tears streaming down her cheeks. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. I backed up, keeping a wide berth between her and my dad, and relayed the horror I was seeing to the dispatcher. "It's my dad. He's lost his leg. He's barely conscious," I stammered, voice cracking. "Please, you need to hurry." The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, asking me to stay on the line, but my mother's desperate cries filled the garage, creating a haunting echo. She clutched at her head, her fingers digging into her scalp as she repeated, "Please, just come back to the table. Just eat. You have to eat." I kept my distance, heart pounding, as I watched her spiral into a frantic haze. But she never laid a finger on me. She only circled back to the door, wailing and begging in a chilling frenzy that made my blood run cold. The police arrived within minutes, their lights flashing against the house, and rushed into the garage to assess the situation. My mother resisted, screaming and flailing as they restrained her, her pleas becoming incoherent sobs as they led her away. I could barely breathe as I watched them take her, her voice a haunting wail that echoed down the driveway, begging me to come back and join her at the table. Paramedics rushed in and began working on my dad, quickly stabilizing him and loading him onto a stretcher. I followed them outside, numb with shock, barely able to process the scene that had unfolded. In the frigid December air, my mind reeled, looping over her chilling words and the horrible sight in that garage. That Christmas, the warmth of family and familiarity had turned into something I could barely comprehend, twisted into a nightmare I would never forget. I stayed by my father's side every day at the hospital, watching over him as he slowly regained strength. On good days, when the painkillers were working and his mind was clearer, he told me everything he could remember about the last month with my mother. She'd been making strange, elaborate meals every single night since Thanksgiving, insisting he try each one. At first, he thought it was just a new holiday tradition, a way to honor Grandpa's recipes, but as the dishes grew more unusual, more disturbing, he realized something was deeply wrong. She had started mumbling to herself while she cooked, almost like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Eventually, he'd stopped eating at the house altogether, sneaking out for meals at nearby diners, finding any excuse he could to avoid her food. He even admitted that on Christmas morning, when he tried to leave, she had drugged his coffee. Everything went hazy after that, and the next thing he remembered was waking up to pain and the horror of what she'd done to his leg. We discussed the recipe book in hushed tones, both coming to the same terrible conclusion. The book had changed her. My father was hesitant to believe anything so sinister at first, but the memories of her frantic insistence, the look in her eyes, made him certain. Somehow, in some dark, twisted way, the book had drawn her into its thrall. By New Year's Eve, he was discharged from the hospital. I promised him I'd stay with him as he recovered, my own guilt over the role I'd unwittingly played gnawing at me. He accepted, his eyes carrying the quiet pain of someone forever altered. My mother, meanwhile, was undergoing evaluation in a psychiatric hospital. Since that Christmas, I hadn't seen her. I'd gotten updates from the doctors. They said she was calm, coherent, but that her words remained disturbing. She admitted to doing what she did to my father, repeating over and over, "We need to do what we must to survive the darkest days of the year." Her voice would drop to a whisper, a distant look in her eyes, as though the phrase were a sacred mantra. On New Year's Eve, as the minutes ticked toward midnight, my father and I went out to his backyard fire pit. I carried the recipe book, feeling its familiar weight in my hands one last time. Without a word, I tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames curled around the old leather, devouring the yellowed pages. It crackled and twisted in the heat, the recipes that had plagued us dissolving into ash. My father's hand on my shoulder was the only anchor I had as the smoke rose, dissipating into the cold night air. But as the last ember faded, I felt a pang of something like regret. Later, as I sat alone staring at my computer, I hovered over the file on my desktop, the digital copy, each recipe scanned and preserved in perfect, chilling detail. I knew I should delete it, erase any trace of the book that had shattered my family, and yet I couldn't bring myself to do it. I feared that it may have a hold on me,